Buenas tardes, bienvenido a este Extension Talk organizado por UC Davis Chile, en que vamos a hablar del problema de las pérdidas económicas causadas por hongos de la madera de vid. Para hoy día, para esta tarde, tenemos dos presentaciones, ¿cierto? Una de Jonathan Kaplan y otra de Gerardo Leal. Las preguntas las vamos a contestar al final y tienen que hacerlas por la sección que dice Q&A o preguntas y respuestas, dependiendo si su Zoom está en español o en inglés. Está en la barra abajo. Al mismo tiempo, la charla va a ser traducida y para escucharla en español, la charla de Jonathan, lo pueden hacer seleccionando el lenguaje en que quieren escuchar abajo en un icono que dice interpretación o traducción. Sin más preámbulos, vamos a pasar a la presentación de Jonathan. Jonathan obtuvo su doctorado en UC Davis en el año 99 y actualmente es profesor en el California State University en Sacramento, profesor de economía, ¿ya? Ha trabajado en el USDA, en el Departamento de Agricultura de Estados Unidos, en el área económica, y a partir de 2003 comienza a trabajar en la universidad. Aparte de su trabajo en enfermedades de la madera de la vid, tiene trabajos en el citrus greening, esta enfermedad viral que afecta a los cítricos, que tiene actualmente una de las amenazas más importantes que tiene la industria cítrica en California. Bueno, nosotros sabemos la importancia de las enfermedades de la madera, no solo en Chile. Se ha dicho que es como la nueva filoxera de nuestros tiempos. Y esta es una más de las charlas que hemos organizado al respecto. Ya tuvimos presentaciones sobre la etiología y la forma de control de las enfermedades con Kendra Baumgartner de UC Davis, también del USDA, con David Gramaje de España, con José Ramón Urbes Torres. Entonces es un tema que hemos estado trabajando hace tiempo por la importancia que tiene. Para los que se preguntan por qué no está Yerko, bueno, Yerko Moreno, que iba a ser uno de los expositores, tuvo un problema personal, entonces no pudo participar, y gentilmente Gerardo, que es el gerente agrícola de Santa Rita, nos va a presentar su experiencia al respecto. ¿Ok? Entonces, Jonathan, please turn on your camera and your microphone, and you can start.
Good morning, everyone. I'm going to switch screens now so I can bring up my presentation. There we go. Thank you for the invitation to talk today about the economic costs of grapevine trunk diseases and the potential gains that come from adopting preventative practices in early young vines, as well as post-infection vine replacement that may occur obviously after vines or vineyards become infected. Just to sort of maybe refresh folks' memory, grapevine trunk diseases are actually a collection of many different types of infections, different sources of the fungi. We typically classify them into 4 general groups: Eutypa dieback, Esca, Phomopsis dieback, and Butyrosphaeria dieback. What we can see here are cross sections of the vines, and you can see that there are these cankers or triangular shaped sections which restrict the flow in the xylem and affects both yield and in some cases the quality of the grapes that may come off of these vines. There may also be foliar symptoms, leaf discoloration, or muted or stunted growth in the vine, so that there's no places for grapes to grow or for them to get proper sunshine or nutrients to provide for healthy vines. Most of these trunk diseases have been affecting California for some time now. We've seen reports throughout the world where these grapevine trunk diseases are a major concern and a major threat. They've been found in young vineyards. They've been found in old vineyards. They're fairly ubiquitous throughout the Mediterranean climate. And here in California, the California wine grape industry was at the forefront of trying to understand this disease and why so many growers throughout California were not adopting practices that were identified by plant pathologists and viticulturalists in order to combat this disease. And so when I was asked to join the project and the research team, it was to try to help identify reasons why growers were not adopting these preventative practices that are often promoted by Extension and other advisors here in California. Typically, when the vines are pruned during the winter dormant season, they're highly susceptible to these grapevine trunk diseases because it takes some time for those pruning wounds to heal. In our dormant season, there's a lot of rain as well, and so that rain helps spread that disease, those diseases throughout the vineyard, splashing and spreading as they go. And so in the winter time here, when we're doing these pruning practices, it takes a very long time for wounds to heal. And so we find that as being one of the main avenues in which these diseases are able to enter the vines. We've seen that the economic cost, at least here in California, and I know there's been work done in Australia as well to look at the economic cost, but we've been studying this disease for some time now, or these diseases here, and a report almost 2 decades ago, found that nearly $250 million is lost annually due to these trunk diseases, which is a considerable amount of money. Similarly, other estimates put the loss at close to 14% of the gross value of wine grape production. On top of that, if you will, we see anywhere from 16 to 60 some odd million dollars spent annually, US dollars spent annually to treat grapevine trunk diseases through these preventative practices, through other sorts of practices, and I'll go through some of those in a little bit. Right, and so clearly we can classify our choices. Let's see here. Okay, just checking my. Anyway, I got to be careful not to click too many buttons. But we have many different options to treat grapevine trunk diseases. We have preventative practices, primarily looking at alternative pruning methods in order to reduce the time that the wounds are present and can quickly heal. There's also remedial vine surgery, which would occur after the vines become infected. Some advisors recommend just replacing the vine. Some advisors recommend replacing the trunk as well. And so we will look at some of these different strategies in a little bit. Similarly, or alternatively, a vineyard may be removed completely in order to eliminate the trunk diseases, in order to remove any evidence or inoculum that may be causing the trunk diseases. And then those areas would be replanted either in grapes or some other cultivar that is economically viable. And so as we looked at these different options, we wanted to understand how they might improve the profitability of these different vineyards throughout California that might be affected by these trunk diseases. We were similarly interested in understanding what happens to the profitable lifespan of these vineyards. As we have come to know about grapevine trunk diseases, and they can significantly shorten a vineyard's lifespan. One of the main concerns here in California from the industry was that vineyards were being replaced on a very frequent basis every 15 to 20 years, when most of the planning and projections look at a vineyard being profitable for 25 years or so. And so the industry was very concerned about the longevity of the vineyards having to incur large capital costs, replacement costs in order to remove all of the vineyard material, take it off site, and allow for replanting to occur. That's very expensive, and obviously then takes several years to recoup that investment because yields are low for several years as cultural practices continue. And so the industry was very much interested in understanding what effect these practices might have on extending these lifespans and the profitability. We asked a couple other questions as well. In a vineyard that lasts many, many years, one can take action at a very young age for the vineyard, or that one can take action much later in a vineyard's lifespan. What we know about grapevine trunk diseases is that they are often unrecognizable for many, many years within a vine after that vine becomes infected. They're cryptic, and it's not until a vineyard is mature. In California, we don't see visible symptoms until the vineyard's 8 or 10 years old. And so along with that, we've also seen that taking preventative actions at that point, although are beneficial, are not sufficient in many cases to bring the profitability of that vineyard back up to what it might be if it were healthy, and it continues to result in a shortened lifespan if we wait until we see the symptoms. And so we also evaluated earlier periods in a vineyard's lifespan. We looked at when they're first established and winter pruning begins or dormant pruning begins. We wanted to see what effect adopting these alternative pruning practices, these preventative pruning practices, might have on both profitability, longevity, and a couple other indicators I'll mention in a little bit. We also looked at adopting these preventative pruning practices at age 5, when the tree is reaching its full maturity and its full yield potential. And then we also evaluate these practices at age 10 in order to see whether it is too late to save the vineyard, so to speak, by adopting that late in the vineyard's lifespan. Some other questions that have come up over the years in studying this is, can we substitute one of these practices for another? Particularly, can we just wait until the vineyard shows symptoms and then remove those vines that are symptomatic, that have the trunk diseases, and extend the profitability and extend the longevity of that vineyard? And so the question we tried to answer most recently is whether vine surgery or vine replacement, if you will, is a substitute for these preventative practices, or do they complement one another? And thus would we be inclined to recommend adopting preventative practices in young vineyards, as well as conducting vine surgery later in a vineyard's life as symptomatic vines are discovered. Just to give you a little background on what's going on here in California, as many of you know, most of our grapes are grown here in California, at least the US grapes, over 90% of them are grown here in California. We have over 880,000 acres of wine grapes here in or total grapes here in California. That includes table grapes and raisin grapes. These numbers have not changed much in the last 2 or 3 years. The value of California wine grapes and other grapes, total roughly about $5 billion a year. So if we're losing, $250 million a year due to these diseases, that's a significant loss from the value of wine grapes that are coming from California vineyards. Just to give you sort of a background of the economic situation here, if we wanted to think about the disease, and this is the model that we've been building off of for many years, this was done by Monkfold many years ago, and it looks at the age of the vineyard and how a trunk disease grows and spreads throughout that vineyard. And you can see that after 10 years, approximately 20% of the vines, if that vineyard is infected, would show symptoms, or I should back up there. By the time the vineyard's 10 years old, nearly 20% of the vineyard is infected. It's at that point that we begin to start to see symptoms and may start to take action in terms of removing vines. If we wait until year 15, we can see, given the growth of that disease in the vineyard, that nearly 75% of the vines are going to be infected by the time we reach age 15. So by the time we see symptoms in year 10, the disease is well established within the vineyard, and it quickly will spread at that point throughout the vineyard. Clearly at age 5, there's not much disease incident within the vineyard. Similarly, year 3, which is not highlighted, but the amount of disease that's spread throughout the vineyard is very low. And one might argue that treating something at that point may be less than beneficial because there's not much disease there. But what we will see in a little bit is that the economics plays out that we should start adopting preventative practices when this vineyard is 3 years old, just because of the benefits that we will accrue over the lifetime of this vineyard are far outweigh waiting to treat the vineyard later. I typically talk about tooth decay in this talk, and the idea is that if we start brushing our teeth at a very, very young age, even though there's no tooth decay present perhaps, or very, very little gum disease, by the time we're old, if we have been brushing all that time, then the disease incident in our older people and our older vines is going to be very, very low because we took action at a very young age. And so it's a similar story here. If we translate this disease into yield impacts for our representative vineyard, and this is just a representative vineyard here in California, we can see that as the disease starts to take hold, by year 10, we've lost nearly 20% of the grape yield, which is significant in many situations because the amount of revenue generated from an acre or a plot, it would lose 20% of its yield, can be quite significant and might lead many vineyards to be pulled out shortly thereafter if no action were taken. If we waited to year 10, or rather if we look out to year 15 for an untreated infected vineyard, we would see that in many cases we would have an additional 50% loss by the time we reach a 15-year-old vineyard. And at that point, many vineyard growers, operators are thinking seriously about removing that vineyard because they're getting very little yield and they're incurring great costs to produce very little yield. And so many of those vineyards are being replaced or were being replaced before these preventative practices were being adopted. If we take sort of an economic look at these yield consequences, and this is again for a representative vineyard here in California, We have many different growing regions here in California, and in different regions there are different yield potentials, and there's different prices that are paid for the different grapes. And this particular vineyard is located in our northern San Joaquin Valley, the Lodi region, which has grown significantly in the last 10 or 15 years as a wine grape producing region. In all these examples, we're looking at Cabernet Sauvignon, primarily because there's a lot of Cabernet Sauvignon grown in California, and we have a lot of information and data on Cabernet Sauvignon. And what we can see here in quite stark terms is that if we don't treat a vineyard, we can see significant losses throughout the vineyard's lifespan. Clearly, by the time the vineyard is 12 years old, if it's untreated, that's the last year we see profitable returns from that vineyard. As we go to year 13, the cumulative returns fall, and thus the profits from that year are negative, and they're negative throughout. And if we were to let this vineyard grow to 25 years, we would see significant losses, upwards of over 150,000 US dollars for an acre, per acre over a 25-year lifespan, which if you consider over 300,000 acres, that's a significant sum of money that's being, or potentially is being lost, that could be recouped if we were able to protect these vines from these diseases and maintain that healthy vineyard trajectory as best as we can. So if we think about the different options that have been discovered through the literature, through field trials, the three main practices in terms of preventive practices that have been identified are delayed pruning, pruning wound protection that would be applied to pruning wound. And here in the US, that's primarily a Topsin product that protects the wounds from any fungi entering the wounds in that capacity. And then there's also double pruning, which is somewhat similar to delayed pruning, where in the first early part of the dormant season, there's some pre-pruning that goes along to just cut back the vines. And then later in February, when there's more sunlight and it's warmer and the pruning wounds heal much more quickly, we would then go through with a second pass where vines would be pruned by hand that were identified as problematic, symptomatic, of concern. The idea here is that that's similar to delayed pruning in that we are making these pruning wounds much later in the dormant season and right before bud break, in order to allow for very quick healing and less time, drier climate, more sunshine for those wounds to heal quickly, and thus the vines are less susceptible to the grapevine trunk diseases getting into those vines. And you can see here on the right-hand side, some of the research shows that these different practices can be quite effective at reducing or eliminating the spread of the disease. One thing to note here is that all of these different types of diseases are found within the vines. There's no one grapevine trunk disease. And so if you look at these different combinations of numbers, at the best, we're going to get 100% if it's just Eutypa. Conversely, if it's just Esca and we're doing delayed or double pruning, we may get very low results, roughly around 20% of the disease is not allowed to spread, so to speak. We get 25% less growth in the disease if we were to use delayed or double pruning. And so in thinking about all these different combinations of the diseases and these different efficacy rates in reducing the spread, we limited our examination to three particular efficacy rates: 25%, 50%, and 75% efficacy. And in looking across the board, we can feel pretty confident that we're going to be close or greater than 50% effective in our treatment of these trunk diseases if we were to apply these practices. And in many cases, we might even be higher at 75% or more. So that's something to keep in mind as we look at these numbers in the near future as we get further slides. If we were to forego these preventative practices in early young vineyards, then we might, once the symptoms become apparent, choose to remove the vine and the trunk as well down to the grafting union where the vine was grafted to the rootstock in order to remove all of the trunk diseases that may be present in the vine. Some advisors may recommend just removing the cordon, but it is possible that that trunk disease can travel all the way down to the root graft. And there's work being done now by some colleagues trying to understand or determine whether those trunk diseases can move past those graft unions, which means that the vine surgery should be done much lower, if not completely removing the vines. So it'll be important to keep an eye on that research as it moves forward. So, as I mentioned earlier, there was concern by the industry that growers were not adopting these practices or not adopting these practices early enough. And when we went out and talked to the growers throughout California, what we saw was that many growers did not adopt these practices until later in a vineyard's life, 8 years or older. The majority of growers throughout California wait to adopt these practices. Many are adopting delayed pruning, primarily because that does not change the cost of pruning. If you switch from pruning in December to pruning in February, it doesn't change the cost of pruning, and so that is often practiced most often here in California. The challenge is trying to delay prune all of your vineyards all at once at the end of the season, and that's not feasible given our labor conditions here in California and presumably in many other grape growing regions of the world. Labor is likely to be restricted, and so there are other options. Pruning wound protectants and double pruning may be adopted, but as we move down this list, we know that they become more and more expensive practices, and double pruning is adopted less than the others in general. On the other end of the spectrum, as we would expect from what we've seen just a second ago, is that these practices are rarely adopted very early in a vineyard's lifespan. I'm happy to say that these numbers are not necessarily indicative of what's going on today, because when we first did this work quite a few years ago, there was obviously much less adoption of these practices then, but as we've been able to find these answers and explore these topics, we have seen much greater adoption of these practices in young vineyards throughout California. We haven't assessed how much more, but I know just with talking with growers and with industry representatives that many are starting to adopt pruning wound protections primarily, and delayed pruning as much as possible. Asking the growers also, why aren't you adopting these practices, and trying to understand, maybe they don't see these practices as being able to maintain yields or not cost effective. And what we found is that most growers in general found that these practices were able to maintain yields, which obviously is a good thing when trying to combat these diseases. We want to maintain those yields so that we can maintain the profitability of the vineyard and also its longevity. But what strikes us as a possible hurdle to adopting these practices is many of the growers found these practices not being cost effective, particularly the pruning wound protectants and the double pruning. it's hard to understand fully why growers felt that delayed pruning was not cost effective, because there's no additional cost to delayed pruning necessarily. But nonetheless, this notion that the practices are not cost effective sort of raised our curiosity as to why growers were seeing that, and we'll get to maybe some of those answers in a little bit as we move forward. We also went and talked to pest control advisors and crop advisors throughout California, conducting a survey, and found that these advisors often would recommend post-infection treatments such as sanitation very regularly. At the other end of the spectrum, they rarely, if ever, would recommend growers remove an entire block to deal with these diseases. And both of these would be post-infection types of practices. I'm not sure why the legend there at the bottom says the post-infection is dark green. It should be orange. As I mentioned earlier, growers can retrain or remove or cut a cordon and retrain new growth. That has been recommended more frequently than removing the vine all the way down to the graft union and retraining from the trunk. And again, that is somewhat counter to our thinking, because there's no way of guaranteeing that removing a cordon is going to remove that trunk disease. Among the trunk diseases, delayed pruning is recommended much more frequently than pruning wound protection or double pruning, which aligns quite closely with what growers are adopting. And so there's this sense that the advice that growers are getting is they're adopting what the advisors are telling them, but what the advisors are telling them, at least when we did these surveys, was not aligned with what we know in terms of the science. And one might understand that these advisors are paid advisors and they're going to make recommendations to growers that the growers are going to want to adopt, and they're not going to necessarily suggest and recommend very high cost practices for a disease that no one can see until a vineyard is 10 years old or older, and which may of course be too late to save that vineyard. If we actually look at the recommendations made by these advisors, what we found was something also quite curious. As the disease incident increases within vineyards, we said, what type of practices do you recommend? And what we see here is that the advice is consistent across both post-infection and preventative practices. As the disease incident grows and grows and grows in a vineyard, advisors are telling growers to adopt these preventative practices more and more as we move across the horizontal axis. We see incidents growing and we see the recommendations growing as well. What's also growing is these post-infection recommendations, which makes sense, but we would think that these preventative practices would be recommended at young vineyard ages to prevent the disease from entering the vineyard, as opposed to not being recommended at low vineyard ages, or just being recommended at young vineyard ages, and as the disease becomes more and more apparent, that these preventative practices would be recommended less and less frequently, and post-infection vine removal would be recommended more. We also had a similar hypothesis that these preventative practices would be recommended all the time, regardless of incident, just as a method of keeping the disease incident as low as possible throughout the vineyard's lifespan. So we were somewhat curious why we saw this parallel pattern, and when we move to later in the talk, when we look at the risk thresholds, it makes a little bit more sense why we might see this upward trend in both these recommendations for preventative as well as post-infection vine removal. So my part, as an economist, I took a lot of this information and built an economic model based on data here in California. The University of California Cooperative Extension provides cost and return studies. That was the basis of our analysis. Those cost and return study look at a profitable lifespan of 25 years. At that point, it's recommended that disease and yields are going to be such that the vines need to be removed at that point. But nonetheless, we do have 100-plus-year-old vineyards here in California. But most of the data and most of the literature suggests a 25-year lifespan. So in our attempt to look at this problem, we also adopted a 25-year lifespan. We looked at how the outcomes might differ by prices and yields, looking at Cabernet Sauvignon production in different regions here in California. We can see how different prices and yields that are affected by where the grapes are coming from may influence adoption of these different practices or the economic outcomes. We also looked at the age of adoption. We looked at the different practice costs, and the DCE is the disease control efficacy rate. If we adopt these practices and they have different efficacy rates, what does that mean for the economics? We consider different discount rates or inflation rates, if you will, because these vineyards span over 25 years. And so we want to be able to account for that investment over that long period of time. And we also wanted to look at the perception of whether a vineyard was at risk of being infected or not. And so a lot of what we've learned about grower adoption plays into their perception of the risk of being infected. And it's fairly common now here in California to think that every vineyard is going to be infected at some point by these trunk diseases. And so it's just a matter of time that it will be visible in a vineyard. It's not a question of if, it's a question simply of when. And so we estimated, in order to understand the economic hurdles or disincentives, if you will, to adopting, we looked at the net benefits, revenue minus cost. We looked at how the last profitable year might be extended by adopting these practices. We also looked at how long it takes for a vineyard to recoup the investment if you're spending $100 a year or $200 a year to combat trunk diseases, and the yields are not changing and there's no sign of the disease. It becomes a question of whether I'm throwing money at my vineyard that has no effect. And so some of the questions we wanted to understand is how long does it take to recoup this funding? And lastly, well, in terms of understanding the practices, we wanted to understand what happens to the probability threshold, where if a grower feels like their infection probability is lower than the economic threshold for adopting those practices, then they shouldn't adopt them. And I'll go into a little bit more detail on that in a little bit as we move through here. Just a little bit of background on where the data comes from, primarily the UC Cooperative Extension, but also USDA and interviews with many growers and advisors. So getting into sort of the thick of things, if we were to look at a representative vineyard here in California, we would see that if we adopt in year 3, which is the earliest we would consider doing dormancies and pruning, we see that given the different efficacy rates, we have the gray line would be 25%, the yellow line or gold line is 50%, and then the blue line is 75% efficacy. We see that if we have a very high efficacy rate, then our yields are very close to what they would be for a healthy vineyard, which of course raises the question, did I ever have an infected vineyard or not? It becomes very hard to see if we adopt this practice at a very early age, whether it is effective at at all because our yields are the same and we don't see any evidence of disease until very late in a vineyard's lifespan. One might argue similarly for 50% efficacy, but we can see clearly that by the time that vineyard's 25 years old, we've lost significant yield, and that would be very recognizable. If we see very low efficacies, then we see a pattern that's very similar to an unhealthy infected vineyard, the bottom orange line, and thus we would, likely be less inclined to see that practice is very effective because it's not. If we translate these yield effects into net returns, we see a similar pattern. If we adopt very early year 3, and we have high efficacy rates, the blue line, then our net returns are fairly similar to what we would see from a healthy vineyard. And conversely, if our efficacy is very low, we see that net returns, we see that concave pattern again, where our net returns start to fall off. Not necessarily at the same age as an untreated vineyard here at year 12 in this particular case, but it does fall off, roughly around year 16. So we do get a few years more profits by adopting, even if we have very low efficacy rates. If we look across all the different regions, and we have 5 different regions that we model given the data that's available, I know this is a lot of numbers here, but the important thing to see here is that the bold-faced numbers are positive net returns over the entire 25-year lifespan. If it's not bolded, it means that over the 25-year lifespan, the profits are not greater than 0 over the entire lifespan. But what all these numbers show is that doing something, whether it's year 3, 5, or 10, is going to generate more profits than doing nothing and waiting until the vineyard just dies out at year 25. Obviously, growers would likely remove the vineyard before the vineyard gets to 25 years of life. We wanted to see what effect these practices have on lifespan, and so we carried it out to 25 years. If we look at the lifespan question, here's again another representative vineyard. We see that if we do take action in year 10, and given the different efficacy rates, we do add years to the profitable lifespan. So that's good. The more effective the treatment, the more years we add to the profitable lifespan. And the earlier we adopt the practices, the more we add to the profitable lifespan. Here we see that if the practice is 25% effective and we adopt, or rather 75% effective, and we adopt in year 5, then we're going to have profitable years every year based on these economic simulations. And if we adopt in year 3, we're going to do the best in terms of extending the profitable lifespan. Something I didn't mention on the cumulative return slide is if we adopt in year 3, we're going to have the greatest net benefits across the entire lifespan of these vineyards, and thus we're commonly recommending these long lifespans. If we look across all the regions, we can see again, if we have high efficacy, 50% or higher, we're having profitable lifespans greater than 20 years, and in many cases, reaching the full 25-year potential. If we adopt in year 10, however, we see that we're not getting that much additional benefit from waiting until year 10, but nonetheless, we are getting a few additional years, even when the efficacy rate is as high as 50%. Moving on to the how many years it takes to recoup the profits. Clearly, when we adopt very early in a vineyard's lifespan, there's not much disease there. There's not going to be that much benefit to adopting in those particular early years. It doesn't take, it takes 4 or 5 years to actually recoup those profits when adopting in age 3. If we do it in year 5, if we adopt in year 5, now there's more of a disease in the vineyard, and so it takes fewer years to recoup those profits. But again, we're seeing those benefits being recouped. In a sense, we have greater net benefits overall by year 7, at least in this representative vineyard. And when we wait until year 10 to adopt these practices, they pay off instantly because there's already 20% infection spread throughout the vineyard, and there's a lot of disease to treat. And so this is not that surprising a result, but it does lend some support to why growers might not think these practices are very effective, especially when they're adopted at very early ages, and further support why they might wait until they see the symptoms in a vineyard. If we look across all the different regions, we see here that in most cases, if we adopt in year 10, we're going to get those benefits back right away. And so that might say, well, let's adopt in year 10, but as we know, that's in many cases waiting too long, and it significantly shortens the vineyard's lifespan. Okay, so the next question that comes up is, well, why do these preventative practices when I can just do vine surgery? And as we sort of come to the big story here is that we can see if we just do preventative practices, the best we can do in at least this vineyard, and this plays out in all the other representative vineyards as well. If we just do preventative practices and we adopt in year 3 and it's 50% effective, and here DP would be delayed pruning, which has no additional costs. We would do less well than if we did vine surgery when the vineyard was 10 years old. We'd also want to wait until the vineyard was 11 years old to do that vine surgery because we want to get as much cleaning done as possible. The 126, 127 is higher than 122, 513. And so we would want to wait until year 11 when there's more of a disease to remove, and then there's less time left in that 25-year lifespan for the disease to get to a sufficient population to significantly alter the yield and thus the net returns. And that bottom line there is no preventative practices. And so what we see here is that if we wait to year 10 and we do preventative practices, we're going to do better than if we just do vine surgery or removing the vine above the graft union. If we adopt sooner in year 5, we're going to do even better if we do both preventative practices and vine surgery. And clearly, if we adopt these preventative practices at year 3 and we do vine surgery, we're going to do the best. So in all of these simulations, in all of these runs that we did, in all cases, the sooner you adopt preventative practices, the better you do if you also conduct vine surgery when you reach a certain threshold in terms of disease incident within your vineyard. If you adopt in year 3, it takes longer to reach that threshold for vine surgery, and thus you're able to push out when you do vine surgery to get a significant amount of the disease, and then you can allow the vineyard to grow out as it would otherwise, because in essence, you're cleaning out the vineyard. You're cleaning your teeth and you're cleaning your gums, so you can go back to, well, you keep brushing and flossing. You would keep adopting these preventative practices after you do the vine surgery, and you would see profits continue to be significant for the remaining 25-year lifespan of the vineyard. Something else we did was, well, what happens if we completely remove the vineyard after a couple of years of negative profits? And what we see here is that in all cases, if we remove the vineyard and replace it with healthy vineyard, we always do better with the preventative practices than we do, oh, I went too far, than we do with just doing vine surgery, like this continuous replacement effort that's going on. Just to sort of close it out with an understanding of, there may still be reasons why growers don't want to adopt these practices. They may not think that they're going to get infected. There's going to be a very low incidence of them being infected with a vineyard. And so we might think in a grower's calculation, they might think, well, there's net benefits of not taking any action here, NA. And if I have a healthy vineyard, my net returns, my net benefits are going to be higher than if I have an infected vineyard, NBI here, if I don't take any action. I can similarly think about the grower calculating the net benefits of taking an action. And if it's a healthy vineyard, the net benefits are going to be lower because they're paying all that money to prevent a disease that's not there. But if they do take action, then their net benefits are going to be higher, and we can draw this dotted line. And we can draw these lines in many different configurations. But the important thing to note is that there's an intersection here. And if we think about the probability of an infection along the bottom axis there, the horizontal axis there, then this threshold tells us the economic point at which a grower should adopt the practice. So if a grower thinks that their probability of infection is beyond pi naught here, then they should adopt the practice because the net benefits are higher. If they're to the left of pi naught, they think the probability of infection is very low, then they should not choose the practice because the net benefits are higher for not taking an action. And so this blue line would trace out those net benefits across the different probabilities, and pi naught would be that threshold. We can add on top of this vine surgery, which would happen after the fact, and I'm just going to run through this a little bit. But what we know from vine surgery is that it would push out that probability threshold. So with the availability of vine surgery, it says to growers, if you have a very high probability of infection, you now may be less likely to adopt that preventative practice if you have vine surgery available to you as well. So if growers know that they have vine surgery available to them, they may delay adopting these preventative practices in early young vineyards where there are trunk diseases because their perceived risk of an infection is below this probability threshold pi VS. Okay, so if we look at the probability thresholds, and we can see when we just do preventative practices, these probabilities are very low and very close to zero, suggesting that growers should adopt these preventative practices. Now this is pruning wound protecting. Delayed pruning, the probability threshold is at zero because there's no additional cost. Preventative pruning wounds tend to be anywhere from $80 to $100 an acre in US dollars. And even at that cost, that probability threshold is extremely low. When we add vine surgery, those probabilities go up in some cases quite a lot if we're looking at the 50% threshold, but they're still very low. And again, we expect every vineyard in California to be infected with these diseases. So even if a grower thinks their probability threshold is, their risk is at 50%, with a 50% disease efficacy rate, they're still going to adopt that practice. Even with a 25% efficacy rate, they're going to adopt that preventative practice as well in these situations. If we look at delayed pruning, we have a little bit different situation because delayed pruning is much more expensive, higher probability thresholds. With vine surgery, we see very large thresholds popping up here, and so a grower may not adopt vine surgery at all if they feel that these practices, their risk is very low, or even below 97 or 90% threshold levels, we see that their growers' risk perception of being infected is going to influence whether they adopt these pruning practices and or vine surgery. Okay, so my last slide, as we move through this, under all scenarios that we've evaluated and we've looked at for wine grapes, preventative pruning practices and vine surgeries do better than doing nothing. We have had incidences in table grape production. We've looked at some examples here in California where the pruning wound, the profit margins are so small that adopting these practices, particularly pruning practices, are not advantageous, but that's only if a grower waits to year 10 and only if preventative practices are have very low efficacy or disease control efficacy rates. As I noted earlier, vine surgery does outperform the best preventative practice when they are done separately and individually, but when they're done in tandem, they complement each other and generate greater net returns for the vineyard and thus and also provides greater profitable lifespans for the vineyards. So our recommendation is to adopt these preventative practices in early vineyards and then conduct vine surgery after infections become apparent. What we also note is that the earlier we adopt these preventative practices, the further out we need to consider vine surgery in terms of maximizing net returns from these vineyards. And lastly, what became apparent is that we don't need to do vine surgery every year. Because it's costly to go in and remove a vine and replant it or regraft it, we considered and looked at a single removal in a large scale process, if you will, and found that it doesn't necessarily make economic sense to go in every year after symptoms are identified to do wholesale vine surgery. It makes more economic sense to try to do it in a more large scale manner when you reach some critical amount of infection so that you can extend the profitability of your lifespan. One last note, we do have a website for this research that's taken place. We also have a economic interactive tool on our website that can allow growers to enter in their cost and yield values and allow them to see what the implications might be for their vineyard. Obviously, these models are built on the California example, but may be advantageous for growers in other regions as well that might be facing trunk diseases. So without further ado, that is the end of my talk for today. I think we're going to wait to take questions until later. So I'm going to stop my screen sharing now. And yes. And turn it over to Samuel.
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. It was a very good presentation. And as you said, the questions at the end. Como decía, las preguntas las vamos a hacer al final. Ustedes pueden mandar por la sección pregunta y respuesta o Q&A que está en la barra de la aplicación Zoom abajo. A continuación pasaremos a la presentación de Gerardo Leal. Gerardo es ingeniero agrónomo de la Universidad de Chile y además tiene un magíster en viticultura y enología sustentable de la Universidad de Lincoln en Nueva Zelanda. Gerardo ha trabajado en distintas bodegas alrededor del mundo, ha trabajado en Francia, en Nueva Zelanda, en California, y en Chile ha trabajado en varias viñas importantes, en el Viña, y actualmente es gerente ahí con la viña centralista. Él nos va a contar un poco de la experiencia que han tenido sobre de cómo manejar esta enfermedad de la madera en la viña Santa Rita.
Hola, ¿qué tal? ¿Cómo están? Voy a proyectar aquí la presentación. Vamos acá primero. Share screen, ahí estamos. Ahí, se ve, creo que se ve eso, ¿no? Bueno, primero agradezco, ¿cierto?, la invitación. Voy a tratar de, en orden del tiempo, resumir un poquito mi presentación que había preparado. Vamos a lo concreto. Bueno, lo primero es que la enfermedad de la madera de la vid, ¿cierto?, se consideran, creo yo, una de las más destructivas que prácticamente, ¿cierto?, nosotros estamos viviendo como industria, no solamente en Chile, sino que en la mayoría de los países productores de vino. El costo económico mundial para la sustitución de vidas muertas se estima hoy día aproximadamente en unos 1.500 millones de dólares al año. Estos son datos que ha publicado la misma OIB, ¿cierto?, en algunos estudios desde el año 2016. Estas enfermedades definitivamente, ¿cierto?, dañan la sostenibilidad del patrimonio vitivinícola, porque estos patógenos definitivamente producen muerte de las vides, ¿cierto?, en el corto y largo plazo. En varias reuniones, ¿cierto?, se ha conversado respecto a cuáles son los tipos, digamos, de hongos presentes, como esca, eutipa, ¿cierto?, Botryosphaeria, que son los hongos que principalmente son los actores dentro de todo este complejo. Hay viñedos adultos afectados, ¿cierto?, como también viñas recién plantadas, ¿cierto?, o que provienen desde los mismos viveros. Y también, ¿cierto?, hemos visto que los reemplazos también pueden verse afectados cuando uno, ¿cierto?, define una estrategia, ¿cierto?, de replante en zonas, digamos, que estaban muy complicadas con estos hongos. En el caso de la enfermedad de Petri, ¿cierto?, el pie negro, que son aquellas enfermedades que afectan más a los viñedos jóvenes, definitivamente reducen la productividad y la longevidad, ¿cierto?, de estos viñedos. La sintomatología ya la conocemos, hemos hablado, ¿cierto?, de estos cankers, ¿cierto?, que uno ve, ¿cierto?, en los cortes transversales, ¿cierto?, en la madera, eso especialmente en los viñedos adultos, y en los viñedos jóvenes, obviamente, también hemos visto que tenemos un retraso en los crecimientos, la disminución del vigor, hay un retraso, una ausencia, ¿cierto?, de brotes en algunos casos, entrenudos cortos, follajes, ¿cierto?, dispersos y cloróticos que se desarrollan, ¿cierto?, inicialmente, algún marchitamiento, muertes que también de repente comienzan a aparecer, especialmente en aquellas plantas que pueden estar afectadas, ¿cierto?, con pie negro o enfermedad de Petri. Y también hemos visto, ¿cierto?, lesiones en raíz, ¿cierto?, en raíces, que vemos algunas raíces necróticas, con la reducción definitivamente, ¿cierto?, del sistema radicular, ¿cierto?, con sus raicillas finas. Hemos visto, ¿cierto?, este tipo de imágenes en varios de nuestros viñedos. Generalmente, ¿cierto?, la fruta que está en estas plantas definitivamente no termina cuajando y tenemos, ¿cierto?, pérdidas más o menos importantes, ¿cierto? Especialmente cuando estos viñedos han sido manejados para una categoría quizás, ¿cierto?, dentro de las más altas, donde la mano de obra, los insumos y prácticamente todo el manejo, ¿cierto?, prácticamente, ¿cierto?, es un costo más o menos importante. Esta es otra foto que también vemos comúnmente, brazos que en definitiva en plantas, un brazo completamente muerto respecto, ¿cierto?, a un lado completamente todavía que sobrevive y que es capaz, ¿cierto?, de producir un vigor y determinados tamaños de brotes que permiten sostener, ¿cierto?, todavía productividad. El ciclo de vida y la epidemiología, ¿cierto?, de estos hongos es bastante ya conocido. Los síntomas pueden tardar varios años en desarrollarse. Creo que es clave un diagnóstico, ¿cierto?, prematuro para ahí, ¿cierto?, según la charla que hemos escuchado anteriormente, establecer las estrategias, si son estrategias más de manejo, ¿cierto?, de convivir con estas enfermedades, o definitivamente hacer una estrategia mucho más de reemplazo, ¿cierto?, o inversiones mayores que significan los replantes. Las heridas de poda son definitivamente el principal punto de entrada a estas esporas fúngicas, pero también, ¿cierto?, hemos visto que heridas mecánicas y algunas viñas heladas también se comienzan a resentir de manera importante. Estos cuerpos fructíferos producidos en la madera muerta, ¿cierto? Sus esporas se liberan definitivamente en invierno, en presencia de agua, se dispersan a través del viento, y obviamente, ¿cierto?, comienzan a infectar heridas nuevas, ¿cierto?, frescas. Es probable, ¿cierto?, que esta es la amenaza más relevante para el sector vitivinícola. En eso coinciden varios expertos, digamos, y vitivinicultores. Los hongos involucrados en estos hongos de la madera, en estos complejos del hongo de la madera, son endofíticos, lo que implica que pueden vivir asintomáticamente, ¿cierto?, una importante parte de su vida, ¿cierto?, en la planta, y en algún momento, debido a algún estrés provocado, que hay varios que se pueden dar, modifican su comportamiento y definitivamente, ¿cierto?, ya comienzan las sintomatologías que nosotros ya hemos visto comúnmente. En términos de impacto a nivel mundial, hasta hace algunas décadas, ¿cierto?, estas enfermedades se asociaban más a plantas viejas, ¿cierto?, a plantas adultas, y donde los principales manejos que se realizaban, ¿cierto?, eran sustituciones de vid afectadas por otras sanas. Recientemente, ¿cierto?, hemos ido observando que estas enfermedades tienen una rápida expansión y definitivamente tenemos plantas, ¿cierto?, de 2 o 3 años de edad, ya también con alguna sintomatología. En general, ¿cierto?, en viñedos de más de 7 años, yo diría que son más o menos el promedio, digamos, desde cuando se comienzan a observar las primeras sintomatologías. Aquí hay gráficos que ya presentó, ¿cierto?, Jonathan en la presentación anterior, que tiene que ver con la incidencia, ¿cierto?, y el compromiso o el impacto, ¿cierto?, de los hongos en los rendimientos. No voy a ahondar en este detalle. Sí me gustaría contarles quizás algo más relacionado, que hay impactos importantes también en otras zonas vitivinícolas en el mundo. En España, por ejemplo, se habla de incidencias que han crecido entre 1,8 desde el año 2003 al 2007 a 10,5% en viñedos establecidos. En Francia se habla que el 13% del viñedo francés, ¿cierto?, se ha visto afectado desde el 2012, con datos del 2014, ¿cierto?, donde se han reducido la producción potencial de vino en un 13%, la presencia de botios aérea, ¿cierto?, y Eutipa dieback, definitivamente, ¿cierto?, las incidencias andan del orden del 10 y 25% respectivamente, y estas enfermedades están costando en Francia un equivalente aproximado de 1.000 millones de euros, que son alrededor de 1.140 millones de dólares, ¿cierto?, anuales en la producción del vino, según el instituto, ¿cierto?, IFB. En Italia también tenemos datos bien concretos que definitivamente, ¿cierto?, estos hongos comienzan a nacer de manera importante en viñedos de 8 a 10 años. Se habla de 12 a 19%, ¿cierto?, de incidencia de la enfermedad en uvas blancas y 8 a 10% en uvas tintas. En el caso de algunas regiones, ¿cierto?, más extremas del centro y sur de Italia, la incidencia de esta, ¿cierto?, ha alcanzado a entre 60 a 80% de algunos viñedos viejos. En Portugal, prácticamente, ¿cierto?, todas las regiones vitivinícolas estarían afectadas. Botiofaeria, ¿cierto?, y esca son las principales enfermedades de la vida adulta, eso coincide, ¿cierto?, como en otras regiones, y definitivamente, ¿cierto?, los estudios en vides jóvenes siguen reportando enfermedades de pie negro y la enfermedad de Petri como las dominantes. En Argentina, el 30% de los viñedos viejos, más de 10 años, y representando ese 81% de la superficie total del viñedo, ¿cierto?, en Argentina, ha detectado la hoja de Malbón, que es lo que se llama ya localmente, que es una enfermedad con síntomas un poquito diferentes, pero que pareciera ser que tienen relación, ¿cierto?, con esca, a esta sintomatología que se ha visto en Europa, durante un estudio que hicieron ellos en el año 2008. En Estados Unidos, aquí hay algunos datos muy parecidos, ¿cierto?, a lo que presentó Jonathan. Las pérdidas económicas son alrededor de unos 260 millones de dólares al año. Si lo llevamos hoy día a cuánto pierden en términos, ¿cierto?, de producción por hectárea, en términos de dólares, se habla de 2.000, 3.000 dólares, ¿cierto?, por hectárea. Eso, digamos, está afectando definitivamente al productor. Eso a modo de introducción. ¿Cómo vemos la situación en Chile? La verdad que quizá este mensaje es un poco fuerte, digamos, al decir que el gran cáncer, digamos, de nuestro Cabernet Sauvignon, que es nuestra principal cepa, está relacionado, ¿cierto?, a los hongos de la madera. Y definitivamente, ¿cierto?, nosotros ya hemos podido ver cuál es el efecto en alguno de los valles. Aquí hay datos, ¿cierto?, que ha levantado, ¿cierto?, Yerko Moreno de la Universidad de Talca, en algunas muestras que son no aleatorias, y vemos que hay pequeñas diferencias en algunos valles. Por ejemplo, en Maipo, en 12 cuarteles que se midieron en un momento, ¿cierto?, se ven prácticamente un 14% de síntomas, de plantas con síntomas. En Colchagua, de 23 cuarteles, un 12%. En Maule, de 45 cuarteles, un 9%. Y en Biobío, de 17 cuarteles, un 6%. Podríamos decir entonces que a lo mejor esta situación es mucho más grave en la zona central, y eso que estamos considerando acá, ¿cierto?, todas las variedades que han sido, en este caso, prospectadas, ¿cierto?, como Cabernet, Chardonnay, Merlot, incluyendo el Cabernet Franc, que es otro cepaje que también está bastante afectado. Ahora, pareciera ser que hay un efecto de susceptibilidad, ¿cierto?, relacionado a la variedad en este caso. Pareciera ser que vemos, ¿cierto?, en menor porcentaje, ¿cierto?, variedades blancas, como Sauvignon Blanc o Sauvignon Vert afectadas. País y Cariñán, en la zona, ¿cierto?, más centro-sur, también pareciera ser que la vemos bastante menos afectada a un Cabernet Sauvignon, un Carmener, un Cabernet Franc, un Petit Verdot y un Merlot más de la zona centro. Podemos hablar más o menos que un 40% de los viñedos de Cabernet Sauvignon de más de 12 años de edad definitivamente tiene una incidencia. Y esta incidencia, más o menos, ¿cierto?, nosotros la hemos podido ver, va entre un 15 y un 50% de plantas enfermas. Si nosotros ahora nos concentramos en Maipo, estas son plantas de 40 años. Nosotros, ¿cierto?, hemos hecho un seguimiento y un monitoreo de estos cuarteles, y según nuestros últimos cómputos, ¿cierto?, en viñedos de 40 años, como ustedes ven ahí en esta presentación, que son materiales masales a pie franco, plantados desde el año 79, 81, definitivamente, ¿cierto?, vemos que hay un 3%, ¿cierto?, de plantas que están en un nivel 1, un 2% nivel 2 y un 31% nivel 3. Nivel 1 le llamamos a plantas muertas, definitivamente. Nivel 2, perdón, nivel 1, bien digo, sí, nivel 1 plantas muertas, nivel 2 plantas que tienen un brazo, ¿cierto?, prácticamente afectado o muerto, y en el nivel 3 hablamos ya de plantas faltantes, que definitivamente se murieron hace un tiempo. Entonces ahí podemos ver que alrededor de un 36% es lo que nosotros vemos más o menos que estos viñedos están afectados y aún persisten productivos. En estos mismos cuarteles podemos también observar cómo se han dado, ¿cierto?, las producciones durante los últimos 14 años. Si ustedes se fijan, en el año 2005, algunos de estos cuarteles estaban en el orden de los 6, 7 toneladas, y definitivamente, ¿cierto?, hoy han caído, ¿cierto?, a producciones entre 2 y 3 toneladas por hectárea. Hay algunos otros cuarteles que son más antiguos, que vienen, ¿cierto?, lentamente bajando su productividad, pero según nuestros registros de los últimos 14 años, vemos que definitivamente la mayoría de estos cuarteles, que son los más antiguos, que prácticamente han estado, ¿cierto?, bajo un sistema de control, entre comillas, preventivo, ¿cierto?, a través de controles químicos, definitivamente han venido, ¿cierto?, deteriorándose su productividad. Las pérdidas que más o menos vemos son en alrededor de 3 a 5 toneladas por hectárea, y eso nosotros más o menos lo hemos evaluado entre $3.000 a $6.000 por hectárea. ¿Qué es lo que ocurre en Colchagua? Otra zona, digamos, de nuestros viñedos, la zona, ¿cierto?, central. También hemos monitoreado, ¿cierto?, algunas plantas de 12 años de edad. Vemos que el Cabernet Franc, por ejemplo, ¿cierto?, que es la segunda variedad que nosotros también vemos bastante afectada. Un 6% está en nivel 1, que está recién comenzando el daño, un 7% en nivel 2, donde prácticamente ya tenemos un brazo muerto, un 9% en nivel 3, donde la planta se murió o ya no existe. En el caso de Sauvignon Blanc vemos, ¿cierto?, un 2, un 4 y un 0,5% respectivamente en los distintos niveles. O sea, podríamos decir que según nuestros últimos cómputos, ¿cierto?, en este campo, definitivamente entre el Cabernet Sauvignon y Cabernet Franc, definitivamente son las variedades más afectadas, y nosotros ya prácticamente hemos venido trabajando durante los últimos 3 años en un proceso de renovación en estos cuarteles, que significa el rebaje como una metodología. ¿Cómo hemos ido conviviendo en Chile con este problema? como les decía, ¿cierto? Prácticamente hemos tratado de seleccionar brotes, criarlos nuevamente, ¿cierto? Sellando esta área, digamos, con pintura para que no vuelva, ¿cierto?, a ingresar el hongo. Y ya hemos, ¿cierto?, reformado plantas desde un principio, digamos, con buenos y malos resultados. Por ejemplo, aquí podemos ver que tenemos una viña donde se hizo, ¿cierto?, un rebaje exitoso, ¿cierto?, en plantas de 6 años. Tenemos otro caso, perdón, ahí me pasé. Ahí tengo otro caso, digamos, exitoso de rebaje, donde volvimos a, ¿cierto?, a renovar estos viñedos, ¿cierto?, después de estos cortes, después de 7 años. Incluso hemos, ¿cierto?, logrado hacer algunos murones, digamos, para ir completando algunas posiciones de plantas entre medio de los viñedos antiguos, como este otro caso, como esta otra foto. Sin embargo, también vemos, ¿cierto?, que después de 3 años hemos hecho este rebaje y definitivamente sin buenos resultados. Aquí prácticamente hay muerte de plantas definitivamente después de haber hecho, ¿cierto?, ese manejo. Hay otros cuarteles donde definitivamente también, ¿cierto?, hemos hecho estas prácticas y después ya de varios años de haber logrado establecer nuevamente, ¿cierto?, el tronco y los cargadores, ¿cierto?, los cordones, volvemos, ¿cierto?, a obtener sintomatologías de este tipo que en definitiva son viñas que no producen y que incluso ni siquiera terminan de cuajar. En algunos otros casos, ¿cierto?, hemos hecho algunos replantes en chilera que son mucho más difíciles de establecer entre viñas antiguas, porque la verdad que los sistemas hídricos están mucho más preparados, ¿cierto?, para regar en la estrategia, ¿cierto?, de viñas productivas y no en una estrategia de formación de planta. Incluso también hemos injertado en algunos casos, ¿cierto?, plantas que todavía tenemos de dudosa sanidad, porque la verdad que no tenemos la certeza si cuánto están afectados definitivamente a pesar de hacer cortes transversales, y también hemos obtenido buenos o malos resultados, como por ejemplo aquí se ve un buen resultado, y en otros casos, ¿cierto?, ya comienza una sintomatología parecida a la que obteníamos desde un inicio. Entonces, ¿cuáles son los resultados de este rebaje de plantas? Definitivamente son costosos, son muy intensivos en mano de obra. Nosotros más o menos hemos destinado alrededor de 50 millones de pesos por año para, ¿cierto?, manejar estas 50 hectáreas. Obviamente nosotros estamos aquí ingresando una desuniformidad, ¿cierto?, temporal dentro del viñedo hasta que no volvamos a formar estas plantas en el viñedo más adulto.
Sí, parece que ¿Me escuchan mejor ahí?
Ahí sí te escuchas bien. Sí.
Ok, sí, parece que perdimos, o que Gerardo perdió la señal. Vamos a ver si se puede volver a conectar. Bueno, ¿les parece que mientras tanto podemos avanzar con las preguntas a Jonathan? Jonathan, are you there? Can you turn on your camera and mic?
I am here.
Okay,
I am here.
okay. Yeah, I think we
So,
lost
me...
Gerardo for some reason.
Some of these questions are in Spanish, so I'm not going to
No,
try to
I have all the
translate
questions
them.
here, so no problem.
But I can
I can translate for you.
Discuss the questions in English here. The first one is regarding double pruning. Double pruning involves a pre-pruning cut with a mechanical pruner at the beginning of the dormant season. And then a second pruning would go through with a hand pruning team to remove the remaining vines that need to be removed before bud break. And so the idea is that by having a second run through the vineyard, the first cut rather has there's smaller wounds that can then have less opportunity for the fungi to enter the wounds. And then going through in February when the wounds heal much more quickly, and go through with a hand pruning team to quickly prune before bud break. And that ideally would reduce the amount of infections going into larger wounds that might be present if pruning was done with a single pass.
Okay.
So,
perfect. Can you
there's
hear me?
Another question here about vine surgery. We would typically recommend conducting vine surgery after a vineyard is 10 years old, because at that point the symptoms are apparent. There's sufficient population of the trunk diseases throughout the vineyard where it would make economic sense to go through and conduct vine surgery. Since you have a crew in there, you can take care of many vines at once. At least in the simulations we've run, we've seen that vine surgery usually is best in year 11, 12, 13, or 14, depending on when preventative pruning practices start. Without any pruning practices, you might wait till year 11 to do vine surgery. And then with the other practices, the earlier you adopt, the later you have to do vine surgery as well. So regardless of whether one does vine surgery or not, we recommend doing preventative pruning practices throughout the entire vineyard's lifespan, as that's the best way to maintain profitability and realize the full lifespan for that vineyard. So maybe I'll turn the mic back over to Gerardo, and we'll get back to the other questions later.
Oh yes, I reconnect my computer here because something was wrong here with the internet connection. I'm okay now. Sorry for that. Ok, decía yo entonces respecto al control. Está claro definitivamente que necesitamos contar con material sano de propagación y de calidad. Prácticamente, ¿cierto? Necesitamos un monitoreo permanente, ¿cierto? Y un control también de una mejor forma de los hongos que, de todas maneras, ¿cierto? Están presentes, ¿cierto? Así como están en el viñedo adulto, también están presentes, ¿cierto? En el vivero. Hemos visto que hay distintas incidencias y severidades, ¿cierto? De los distintos hongos, ¿cierto? En plantas, en vivero. Y definitivamente, ¿cierto? Hay opciones de control o de paliar definitivamente esto al inicio, digamos, de cualquier proyecto. Quizás uno de los mejores tratamientos ha sido el uso del agua caliente a 51, 53 grados Celsius por 30 minutos, que obviamente depende de la variedad. Pareciera ser que hay un tema de variedad que es mucho más tolerante a este tipo de temperaturas, que también son muy estresantes de todas maneras como un sistema de control. Otra cosa importante, creo que los viñedos tienen que establecerse con buenos sistemas de raíces desde un inicio. Tenemos que evitar, ¿cierto?, el estrés hídrico severo y el desbalance de las plantas, es decir, no podemos manejar viñedos, ¿cierto?, con estrés demasiado severo, y al mismo tiempo, para este tipo, por ejemplo, una planta como la que vemos acá, un desbalance donde prácticamente con brotes cortos no podemos, ¿cierto?, tener viñedos con ciertos rendimientos. Tenemos que tratar de balancear las plantas y volverlas a vigorizar antes de planificar, ¿cierto?, nuestra producción. Si ustedes se fijan, hay un avance de este problema, ¿cierto?, que está relacionado al estrés hídrico. Aquí hay dos curvas, una curva de abajo, ¿cierto?, en rojo, donde es una condición normal respecto, ¿cierto?, a una planta en años, en producción, y el porcentaje de plantas enfermas. Hay una correlación en que mientras más las plantas en determinado año estén bajo estrés, definitivamente, ¿cierto?, hay la posibilidad de encontrar mayor cantidad, un mayor porcentaje de plantas enfermas. Otro tema importante, creo yo, que tiene que ver con el manejo de la poda. Desde un principio creo que es importante diseñar nuestros sistemas de poda, nuestros sistemas de producción, y evitar cambios abruptos de poda. Generalmente nos hemos encontrado con situaciones donde, por ejemplo, hemos establecido una viña que está en un cordón apitonado y después tratamos de llevarlo, ¿cierto?, a viñas en cargador, y definitivamente esas plantas terminan por manifestar inmediatamente, ¿cierto?, después de ese cambio, digamos, muy robusto del sistema de poda, terminan siendo plantas muy enfermas, ¿cierto?, al corto plazo. Por lo tanto, creo que la recomendación de todas maneras va en evitar esos cortes gruesos. Hay que remover el resto de los restos de poda, ¿cierto?, que estén infectados, especialmente en los cuarteles que presentan alta sintomatología. Jonathan también habló del retraso de las fechas de poda, que también es una cosa que funciona, como también, ¿cierto?, se han obtenido algunos resultados que las podas muy tempranas también disminuyen la posibilidad de repartir estos inóculos que se dan, ¿cierto?, en terreno. Se habla también de las dobles podas o las prepodas, que también, ¿cierto?, habló Jonathan desde el punto de vista, ¿cierto?, económico. Y yo también me quedo con otra cosa que tiene que ver con estas podas que respetan el flujo de la savia. Hemos visto, ¿cierto?, ahora, hace un tiempo atrás, que necesitamos tratar de establecer nuestros sistemas, digamos, de poda, nuestras metodologías, siempre abordando podar la madera del año y no hacer ciertos cortes robustos que obviamente tienen mayor susceptibilidad al ingreso de estos hongos. Tenemos que considerar dejar estas zonas de secación de los vasos conductores principales, y que tiene que ser al menos proporcional al corte que estamos haciendo. Esto significa, ¿cierto?, respetar el subflow, definitivamente podar siempre las viñas por el mismo lado, y no, ¿cierto?, desordenar, ¿cierto?, la situación, digamos, del movimiento de la savia. La idea es seguir reduciendo esta superficie de corte, ¿cierto?, y respetar las coronas, no sobrecargarlas de cortes, que también es una fuerte entrada, digamos, de los patógenos, y definitivamente estas zonas de secamiento terminan siendo una zona de protección, definitivamente, para estas plantas. Entonces, dentro de las consideraciones finales, creo yo que tenemos que tratar de avanzar en un correcto establecimiento del viñedo. Tenemos que manejar nuestras viñas sin estrés. Tenemos que procurar un manejo de poda, en qué poda vamos a realizar, en el número de cortes, en la época que queremos hacer esta poda, la protección química, biológica, que ambas son totalmente viables, la eliminación de la madera de las plantas enfermas, y un monitoreo e intervención temprana. ¿Qué es lo que se viene a futuro? Por lo que hemos visto, ¿cierto?, y lo que dicen los investigadores, pareciera ser que el diagnóstico temprano sí o sí sigue siendo una muy buena opción, ya sea a través del uso de tecnología, ¿cierto?, del uso de drones, etcétera, que eso pareciera ser que va a venir en desarrollo, o con imágenes satelitales que también se están probando últimamente. Pareciera ser que también viene un tema de cuál susceptible puede ser, ¿cierto?, una variedad, y qué resistencia le puede otorgar, ¿cierto?, al hacer algún trabajo genético, ¿cierto?, en estas vides viníferas. Hay un trabajo muy importante que se continuará haciendo, ¿cierto?, en la etapa de vivero, donde en definitiva, ¿cierto?, tenemos que incluir estos manejos integrados entre químicos, biológicos, para reducir estas infecciones desde un origen, desde un principio. Y definitivamente seguro que vienen algún desarrollo de bioagentes o fortificadores de planta o productos alternativos que en definitiva ayuden a tratar de disminuir la susceptibilidad de estas plantas a los hongos de la madera. Eso por mi parte.
Ok, Gerardo, muchas gracias. Voy a poner el audífono. Mejor.
Gerardo, muchas gracias por tu presentación. Jonathan, if you're there, I'm going to ask you in English, so don't use the translator, please.
Hello?
Yeah, can you hear me?
I didn't hear you.
Okay, don't use the translation, the interpreter.
I turned it off.
Okay, perfect. Now you can hear me. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay, so we have several questions, and I'm going to start with in the models you use, do you include the cost of the land?
We don't include the cost of the land. We look at the production costs, the cost in starting and establishing a vineyard and looking at replanting a vineyard. We do look at those initial costs of establishing a vineyard. So there's an annualized cost associated with that. But we're primarily looking at the change in the production costs.
Okay, perfect. Now, you mentioned that all vineyards will be eventually infected, right, at some point. So, and Gerardo mentioned that the plant material we use for planting is very important. Have you looked at that, at the importance of the plant material, the planting material?
I have not in my analyses. I know that there's been work done on looking at different cultivars, different varieties of grapes to see how they might be more or less susceptible. I don't know. I'm not familiar with whether work has been done on rootstock and the microbiome in the soils to see how those interact to make for a healthy vine.
Okay, perfect. Gerardo, I'm going to ask all the questions to Jonathan first, and so he doesn't have to move from Spanish to English in the interpretation, and then I'll have some questions for you. Okay, Jonathan, what affects the efficacy in your model? You show different levels of efficacy, like 75, 50, or 25. Is just a model, or do you actually have any factors that affect efficacy?
We simulate in the model those different efficacy rates based on the findings from the field trials. Okay. So we selected 3 different efficacy rates to sort of match the high, medium, and low range of efficacy rates found in the literature from field trials and laboratory experiments.
Okay, and then you also talk about the probability of infection and also the perceived risk of infection, right? Now, do you have an idea of the real risk versus the perceived risk that the grower has?
We have a sense of what the economic threshold is from the yield effects and the cost effects. We can figure out what the economic probability threshold is, but growers span the spectrum. Growers have many different perceptions of what their risks are in terms of whether they're going to get the disease or not. And so we didn't try to say what growers' perception is or what the actual risk is, but instead say this is what the economic threshold is in terms of the benefits that you would get from adopting one practice or another.
And by looking at that, do you think that the growers are more optimistic or pessimistic in terms of having an infection in their vineyard?
Well, I think the idea is that many growers were not adopting practices, and maybe they thought, one, they weren't going to get the disease, or two, they didn't think that the practices were cost effective.
Mhm.
And what we see in the analysis is that the practices are cost effective, and you'd have to think that you have no risk of getting trunk diseases to not adopt something.
Mhm.
Right? Those probabilities are very low in terms of those economic thresholds. And so what we found is that more and more growers, some of the large production, Mondavi produces hundreds of thousands of acres of grapes. They've adopted pruning wound protections throughout their vineyards. A lot of the larger operations are moving more and more towards adopting these practices, given what we've learned about the cost effectiveness and the likelihood of infection.
Okay, perfect. And
But
this
that's
is a question.
anecdotal. We don't have actual.
Okay, sorry.
Go ahead.
I have a question that you can ask, and then I'm gonna ask Gerardo to give his ideas on that too. Do you see or did you evaluate any differences in cane prune versus spur prune, and on the size of the cuttings you do in the vines at the time of pruning?
I think the answer we didn't look at the difference between cane pruned and spur pruned. I think I'm probably going to get this wrong as not being a viticultural or plant pathologist, but I think most of the vines are, I may get this wrong, but I think most of them are cane pruned in California, but they may be predominantly spur pruned. I'm going to have to check my notes. But we didn't look at the difference between cane pruned and spur pruned in terms of the efficacy of these practices. I didn't personally look at them. I know Kendra Baumgartner and some of the other folks at UC Davis up here down the road have looked at some of those factors. And in terms of the size of the pruning, the cuttings, I don't have details on that either. But I would think that given the different ages of the vineyards, the canes are going to be of different size. The cordons are going to be of different thickness.
And in terms of spraying the fungicide versus painting the fungicide, did you look at that in your analysis?
We have looked at spraying as well, primarily in the table grape sector of wine production. There's a lot more mechanization, if you will. A lot of our vineyards, particularly up north here, there's a lot of hands-on management, a lot of vine inspection. The southern part of the state, where we have much more large-scale production, raisin, table grape, and wine grape, there's a lot more mechanization, and so we did evaluate in terms of table grapes these other practices in terms of spraying from ATV or mobile tractors, but the economics plays out similarly. Because you're on a tractor, you may have lower costs associated with the equipment because you're not hiring labor, but you have to spray more because you're not as directly applying on the wounds with a paintbrush. You're going through, and you can't see my hands, you're going through and spraying as you go along, so you have to apply more so you get more coverage, and so those offset one another, and you get the same relative economic outcomes for whether you hand paint or you spray.
Perfect. Okay, I'm going to switch to Spanish to ask Gerardo. So, Gerardo, bueno, tú estabas escuchando ahí las preguntas y hay varias relacionadas a la diferencia que pudiera haber entre plantas podadas en pitón versus cargador, ¿ya? A la aplicación con una pulverizadora versus pintar, ¿cierto? Y quizás tú también nos puedes ayudar con otra pregunta que había respecto al uso de fosfitos en el viñedo como una forma de disminuir los síntomas de la enfermedad de la madera.
Sí, respecto a lo primero, al sistema de poda entre cargadores o cordones apitonados, la verdad que nosotros hemos visto que la incidencia, digamos, y el porcentaje de plantas infectadas, no tengo la medición exacta, pero sí nos encontramos en ambos casos, digamos, con plantas que en definitiva desarrollan la enfermedad. Creo sí que donde hemos visto mayores porcentajes de incidencia, digamos, de plantas enfermas en aquellos lugares donde, como decía en la presentación, comenzaron como una viña podada en cordón apitonado y en algún momento, ¿cierto?, en la idea de, en aquellas plantas masales, con la idea, digamos, de mejorar los rendimientos y tener racimos un poco más grandes, nos pasamos a una poda en cargador y esas plantas las vemos muy complicadas. Yo diría que esas son como aquellas plantas que más han sufrido. También yo creo que sigo pensando en la relación que hay, ¿cierto?, entre las situaciones de estrés, ya sea por un estrés hídrico o alguna plaga o alguna enfermedad, ¿cierto?, que tú también tengas en el suelo, como el caso de los nematos, los margaroes, también de alguna manera le entregan un cierto estrés a la planta y pareciera ser que eso también promueve definitivamente en que las plantas, ¿cierto?, desarrollen en forma más prematura, ¿cierto?, el tema de los hongos de la madera. Nosotros hemos medido, ¿cierto?, hemos diagnosticado hongos de la madera, ¿cierto?, en viñedos recién plantados, con 2 años, digamos, de antigüedad recién plantado, y nos hemos encontrado con hongos, incluso en plantitas que vienen de los viveros, porque los hongos están en todas partes, definitivamente, ¿cierto?, sinópulo se puede dar en cualquier lado. Y definitivamente, ¿cierto?, ahí también pienso que hay un issue que se puede ir mejorando. Ahora, respecto a la segunda pregunta del uso de los fosfitos, la verdad que nosotros no lo hemos establecido como una estrategia. Lo probamos hace muchos años atrás, ¿cierto?, el uso de los fosfitos para tratar de tener viñedos más activos, qué sé yo, y más balanceados, y qué sé yo, con una expresión de vigor, ¿cierto?, un poco mejor de aquellas viñas que estaban más complicadas. Sin embargo, creo que las otras prácticas, ¿cierto?, que promueven definitivamente tener una viña que esté activa, de todas maneras prevalece, creo que por sobre el uso de un producto en especial, en este caso el uso de los fosfitos.
Okay. ¿Cuál es para usted la efectividad lo que hablaba Jonathan del vine surgery, o sea, de cortar los troncos y reformar una planta? ¿Qué efectividad tienen ustedes en ese sentido?
Yo diría que nosotros hemos sido capaces de ir recuperando aquellos viñedos que están, ¿cierto?, con un grado de incidencia entre un 5 y máximo un 10%, son viñedos que somos capaces de recuperarlos con esa estrategia. Obviamente que hay que hacerlo bien, los cortes, ¿cierto?, hay que protegerlos, es bastante demandante en mano de obra, ¿cierto?, y bastante costoso. Sin embargo, ¿cierto?, hemos tenido buenos resultados en la mayoría de los casos. En los viñedos, en aquellos viñedos donde prácticamente, ¿cierto?, ya vemos mayor incidencia, sobre un 25, un 30% de plantas enfermas o plantas que se murieron en el camino, la verdad que eso ha costado mucho más establecerlo, porque definitivamente nosotros volvemos, ¿cierto?, a formar un brote desde abajo, volvemos a hacer la cirugía, volvemos, ¿cierto?, a hacer crecer estas plantas y definitivamente, ¿cierto?, después, al cabo de 1 o 2 años, vuelven a manifestar la sintomatología.
Perfecto.
Quizás por eso mismo, hemos ido también más por, en algunos casos, ¿cierto?, donde hemos tenido mayor incidencia o plantas afectadas, hemos ido más por la estrategia, ¿cierto?, de el replante y la reinversión, digamos, en viñedo, que definitivamente, ¿cierto?, ahí logramos después de 3 años llegar a la producción y al costo por kilo necesario.
Perfecto, gracias Gerardo. Jonathan, can you hear me? You there?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So, so in all your models, you did your calculations to 25 years, right? And you showed that in some cases with some efficacy or some measures of prevention, you can have a profit around year 8, 10, or 12, right? Is it a good idea to not keep the vineyard 25 years, but just do it for 12 years and then replant? Have you done that calculation?
We did do those calculations when we looked at completely removing a vineyard after 11 years versus with no preventative practices and no vine surgery versus removing vines at earlier than 25 years with the preventative practices. And when we looked at that land, if you will, for 3 generations, or actually we went out to 75 years to capture 3 full vineyard lifespans, if you will, we found in most, if not every case, that vine surgery every 11 or 12 years is the is the least economically beneficial way to operate a vineyard that's affected by trunk diseases. You're going to get the lowest returns. You're going to invest incredible sums of money ripping everything out and replacing it every 12 years than you would spending $100 a year doing an acre to do some preventative pruning wound practices. In all cases, the only time it didn't come out worse, it was identical to the worst case scenario for adopting pruning wound protections, which would be adopting in year 10 with very low efficacy.
Perfect. Well, you show a lot of information. Go for it.
I just wanted to return to the earlier question, and I knew I got it wrong. Most of our wine grapes are spur pruned and not cane pruned. So.
Perfect. They're probably mechanized the pruning, right?
Yeah.
So for those of us who are not economic major, you show a lot of tables, a lot of return, and it was very clear when looking at each table. But if you could like summarize, and this is my last question, what would you say is the best approach for a vineyard manager that wants to keep his vineyard working and healthy or profitable for the 25 years? What to do starting? What would you recommend?
What was the recommendation be for such?
Yeah.
Our recommendation would be to adopt a preventative pruning wound practice, either delayed pruning if there's sufficient labor, or pruning wound protectant because it's less costly than double pruning, starting when dormant season pruning begins. And in different countries, different environments, it's different, but here it's by the time the vineyard's 3 years old, or the 3rd leaf, if you will. That's when we consider a vineyard established. We're going to we're not going to work on training the trunk, and we're going to work on doing winter pruning here at least. And so we would do preventative practices starting at year 3 and continuing through the vineyard's lifespan, right? Just like brushing our teeth. And then depending on the efficacy of those practices, right, you're not gonna do vine surgery until the vineyard's maybe 13 or 14 years old, when you have sufficient trunk diseases in the vineyard where you can go in and clean it out and start over anew, and get your full lifespan. So preventative practice at when winter pruning starts, and then vine surgery in years 12, 13, or 14, depending on the severity of the infection.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Jonathan. That was great. Thanks.
Thank you.
And one last
Thank you,
question.
Sam.
So you just said do the vine surgery just once, right? Not every year after year 14, right? That you said that was the most profitable practice.
That's what we found in our analysis, that
Okay.
it doesn't necessarily it's not necessarily cost effective to go in every year and search out the vine that's infected, because it takes a lot of time and effort and labor to find those vines, right? If you clean out your vine, it's going to take some time before you start seeing symptoms again, right? And the question is, do you go in every year and spend all that money every year to find 1 or 2 vines, or do you wait until you have maybe 20 or 30 vines and it's much easier to see, and then you can go in and sort of grab those all at once? And that's what the numbers have told us.
Okay, perfect. Gerardo, I don't know if you have any comment. You want to say something at the end?
No, yo creo que está todo más o menos dicho. Yo creo que ha sido interesante la presentación de Jonathan, porque le ha puesto número definitivamente a los distintos manejos que quizás tenemos más o menos, ¿cierto?, probados. Yo creo que eso ha sido re interesante dentro de esta charla, de todas maneras.
Gracias. Okay, so Jonathan, I just want to thank you again for presenting your work to us. It was very, very informative, very good. And as Gerardo just said, it's probably the first time we have seen numbers and prices and cost and net returns, and it's not easy to us to understand as viticulturists, but it's very, very good. So thanks a lot. Y con eso, bueno, quiero agradecerle a todos los que han participado hoy día. En esta Extension Talk relacionada a los problemas del hongo en la madera. Si alguna pregunta quedó sin contestar, que hay algunas probablemente, podremos verlas después por correo. Las presentaciones quedan grabadas en el canal de YouTube de UC Davis Chile, que está en la página web de UC Davis Chile, y cualquier consulta que tengan respecto a esta u otras actividades la pueden hacer a Catalina Montalvo, que nos organiza. Así que le damos las gracias nuevamente a todos los que participaron y a nuestros 2 expositores. Muchas gracias.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.